3.2 grams. Psilocybe cyanescens. Yo, what's up? It's someone that's someone, and welcome back to today's report. Today's report was sent in by Nova, when this happened, summer of 2018, the drugs used, mushrooms and cannabis, at a dose of 3.2 grams of mushrooms, the route administration, orally, weight 115 pounds, age 16, height 5'11", for his prior experience, about 30 mushroom trips, and the setting, a park, trail, his friend's house, and then his house. Alright, welcome to another mushroom report. This one's sticking out because it's a different species of psilocybe. Notably what sticks out is the alkaloid content is going to be much different. There are about a dozen different species, and each one has varying alkaloids that'll stick out that can provide a different trip. Most commonly though, across all the species, the main alkaloids at play are going to be psilocybin and psilocin. With cyanescens, it reportedly has a higher content of psilocybin but lower content of psilocin compared with cubensis, which psilocybin itself will be converted to psilocin in the body, so we can expect the trip and effects to be similar and on par with cubensis. Even so, these differences may influence a different kind of trip. Some report that this is stronger than cubensis, but considering natural potency variations, it's hard to say which one would actually be more potent. But this trip here by Nova just shows that under an eighth, these bad boys can provide a full-fledged psychedelic experience. With around 30 trips under his belt, he claimed this was the most powerful experience he's ever had. And the mushrooms really do just take him and expose him to the experience. He's barely able to do things and get by well himself, which, later on, he says he has an ego death. This is a really great trip, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this. So without further ado, let's dive right into this. I had this trip the summer of 2018. My good friend scored some really potent shrooms, grown in a home lab. The places I tripped were a beautiful park near me, Washoe, along a half-mile nature trail in the park, one of my buddy's houses, and my house. I had two sober trip sitters with me, two of my favorite smoking homies. We'll call them E and Z. They each took a tiny cap to celebrate the new plug. It was unusually hot this day, 95 degrees. This caused a few strange feelings during my trip. My intentions with this trip were to connect more with nature, as well as discover the subtle differences in your psyche while being in nature. I wanted to test creativity enhancement. I also wanted to discover more about my mind, go deeper into the inner workings. I was ready to take a plunge. I ran into them walking to the store to pick up some supplies for my trip. I strapped my lunch bag to my backpack filled with pretzels, water, and juices. I brought a pencil, paper, and markers to draw during my trip. My original plan for the day was to take a hike up into the mountains nearby, but the day was way too hot for a hike. We sat down at one of the benches in the park, a short distance away from the river. This river in particular has lots of ripples through the water, falling in waves over smooth rocks. I readied myself for a minute or two and went to sit against a nearby tree. Hopeful and excited thoughts bolted through my mind when I pulled out the bag. I gave my friends a small cap and mowed down the huge pile in a minute or two. Z looked at me really impressed, telling me that was the fastest she saw someone finish a bag. I sat back down at the bench and chilled for about 15 minutes. Within 20 minutes, I was feeling a come on. I noticed the first signs of a trip coming on by a small tingle in my waist area. I also had a boosted sense of giddiness, feeling really playful. I sat, focusing on the present moment as best I could. I felt a rising increase in my skin sensitivity. The wind flowing over me and the sounds of the river rushing started to intensify. E told me to go for a short run over to the playground and back, about 60 meters. I did. I noticed that I felt much more locomotion than I actually made. It felt like I was running at a sprint pace, yet I was only running a moderate jog. I got back to the table, still feeling perfectly energetic. I laughed a little and asked why E wanted me to run. E told me it would come on a lot faster. I was really excited. About 10 to 15 minutes later, I started to notice very small, minute details in my environment. It was as if I could see every blade of grass. I could feel everything about the present moment in nanoseconds. A huge state of bliss flooded me. I started to notice the heat felt really intensified. This was the only uncomfortable thing I felt, but I wanted to stay and meet my intentions. When an hour had passed, I was already astounded. I'll now try my best to describe the ineffable visuals. I perceived my vision split into 6 equal rectangles. It was like the edges of my vision and my focus, but in astounding ways. I noticed different swirling, melting, breathing, and blooming patterns, each very different in the split sectors of my vision. I felt like I was being pulled into the patterns, so much so I felt like my soul was connecting on a complete level with nature. The grass, flowers, trees, and rivers were calling to me, and I felt a sense of ever-present and infinite love. The mental effects of this trip were definitely the strongest I've ever felt. I'd say I'm pretty experienced with shrooms, doing lots of self-work and having about 30 or so trips under my belt. It was like getting to know myself completely. I felt very connected back to my roots, like I share consciousness with nature. I realized and felt pity that we'd come from nature, and know are thriving and placed as the top species, and yet have come so far away. My mind flashed between realistic sequences in my head, sort of like mental films. I watched as huge stacks pump black smoke into the sky. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles drove along pumping what I felt as poison into the air. I perceived the earth as a living, loving being for the first time. My perception of the current state of the world shifted to fear and sadness. I felt like we were going to doom ourselves. I immediately felt an instinct to find solace in nature, to really see the full extent of beauty. Then I sat up out of my trance to go and sit by the water. I sat on the grassy bank, taking my shoes off and dipping my toes into the water. The current rushing along my skin felt like a huge hug from nature, asking me to stay respectful and reminding me I'm always loved. The taller grass on the edge of the riverbank started to grow around my legs. This took me back to my days as a child, the few good days I would wade in rivers and play around in parks with my dad. This was a great thing to experience, as recently we hadn't been on the best of terms. I felt like an immeasurable amount of resentment was lifted out of my mind. I was humbled as I saw my dad for a lot of great things he's done. I realized that although we might not always agree and we sometimes get into too big of fights over stupid things, I'll always have someone to teach me new skills and someone I should cherish the good times with. I realized just how temporary this human experience is in that moment, as I reflected on my dad being 38. I also realized some of my own irresponsibility in taking care of the house and my family. I understood this was the root of a lot of fights. This was a great feeling to forgive every wrong my dad had done to me. I realized his mental health really wasn't in the best spot. I immediately felt overwhelmingly strong love for him, for my family, and friends. I learned that we have to accept and reflect the emotions of others. I learned just how much a power a single ear and caring acceptance can have to change a person's well-being. We walked along the nature trail until I came to a really beautiful spot by the river. I was sitting on a fallen log, watching the river flow by, and astounded at how beautiful, simple reality can be. This is where I spent the next hour of my trip, according to Z. The river looked like the most intricate oil painting you can imagine, and I was mesmerized by the imagery. I watched the water ripple and cascade over the smooth rocks sticking out of the surface. I saw so deeply into the water. I perceived it as a conscious, kind entity. The rushing sounds of the current were enhanced so deeply. It sounded like an orchestra of sounds inside of every second the water ran. This was probably the only scary part of the trip. However, I still see it as beneficial to this day. It was sort of like a needed tough love. I looked down to observe the valleys I perceived inside my skin. Like every pore was a crater. I then saw a dark brown spider run pretty quickly up the back of my hand to my bicep, where I swatted it off promptly. To this day, I'm not sure if that was a real spider or not, but my subconscious fear intensified. I was hallucinating big, unnaturally colored, and long-limbed spiders inside of everything, all over the trees, the ground, my skin, clothes, and friends as well. They were starting to crawl inside of me, my hands just phasing through them, swatting to no avail. They, being great trip sitters, saw me getting a little bit alarmed. They came to my side and asked if I was okay. I couldn't comprehend time or language at this point. I felt like I was speaking gibberish. I held up a finger and told them I just needed a moment. I was shaking from the huge adrenaline rush. I stopped swatting wildly, facing the uncomfortable crawling sensations and throwing away the fear. I accepted their place in this world and accepted their investigation. They started diminishing, and I felt a huge sense of relief. I noticed just how much our willpower to survive and our bravery can do for us. I felt like I accomplished an insurmountable task, shaking my severe arachnophobia. The heat was triggering intense feelings of survival instinct. I poured some water on my head, starting to overheat a little bit, and splashed my face with the cold river water. I felt like the river was congratulating me on my accomplishment and helping me in return. The river gave me a feeling of strength and courage. I was embraced by nature. I was told I was beautiful. I was comforted from all the petty fears I had of rejection. I was free from the sense that I'm ugly or uncomfortable to be with. This was one of the most liberating moments of my life, being someone who struggles a lot with self-destructive thoughts and a toxic self-image. Only recently, and thanks hugely in part to this trip, have I been able to start shedding those thoughts and accepting myself. I went to Z's house with both of them. Her uncle was playing Fallout 4. He was in a certain part of the map with a whole bunch of dead trees and a camp. I didn't know he was trying to get a drop, replaying the level, and loading saves. This sent me into an intensely strong time loop. I would see him raid the camp, shoot the bandits, say something like, "Damn," and look at me. He didn't say anything. I'm not exactly sure how long I spent here at this point, but I felt so dissociated from time and this reality that I called out Z and E, playing around with E and calling him a troll. The only words I understood from Z's uncle were, "They left half an hour ago." Apparently my sitters had to go handle a friend that had just gotten himself hurt. I looped for another 15 minutes, but what felt like days' time. I spent this loop trying to leave the house and go home. I would sit up from the couch, go to walk out the door, only to realize I forgot my bag. I would sit back down, watch Z's uncle play Fallout, then sit up again, only to forget my jacket, and so on. He later told me I spent 15 minutes getting up and walking to the door every so often, just to forget something. It was awe-inspiring and really gave me a sense into how long eternity would be. I made this short walk home after going number 1 in an alley. It was only 3 blocks, but it looked like the sidewalks and streets just kept stretching. I again felt a huge sense of willpower on this journey. I felt confident in my ability to succeed, which again came few and far between. The rest of the trip was spent in my room, lying down on my bed. I observed the powerful peak closed-eye visuals. I saw an ever-deepening, swirling spiral pattern of bright color. It sort of looked like a Candyland board, which the thumbnail was the best picture I could find to match. However, it was infinitely more organic and interesting. I was spoken to by seemingly benevolent and extremely smart entities. I perceived them as the controllers of my reality, operating my life experience and perception behind the scenes. They told me that the biggest thing holding us back is our intolerance, distrust, and judgment of our fellow man. Our biggest downfall will be adhering to the very few in power, absorbing the blind hate speech of history's monsters, and showing no remorse for other groups. I felt like what it was like to be on the receiving end of the hatred given towards everyone different. I felt the hatred of racism, the deep and burning distrust it leaves between us, the feelings of pure inferiority. I felt the undeserved hatred of different sexual orientations. It brought me to tears out of pity. I reflected upon the state of the world from the beginning of humans to that very moment, all in seconds. I knew that distrust and hatred, as well as violence for huge amounts of history, was sending our species into a downward spiral in many ways. I understood that we had been losing or outright disregarding other cultures, opinions, and our fellow man's sense of worth and mental state to elevate just ourselves. I felt like what it was like to be alienated in the world. Many societies spread and encouraged mistreatment and fear of foreigners. I felt the hatred that old problems can leave for centuries into the future. I immediately recognized that the only way we can elevate as a species is to work together. The visuals at this point were all-encompassing. It was very hard to tell where any object started and ended. I completely lost my sense of body, melting into my bed. Meditating with eyes closed, phosphoric, swirling organic patterns of indescribable complexity filled my vision. I felt a complete ego death, losing any memory of my life. Having no sense of body and no objective identity, I felt like a refined being. I felt liberated and free, experiencing reality in an awe-inspiring and comforting way. I gradually came down from there, snacking on the pretzels and juices I had packed. I ended up falling asleep after the visuals died down, drifting off in a very accomplished headspace. This trip gave me a new love for life, and it was very humbling in so many indescribable ways. I felt immense connection with my common man, as well as pity for all the suffering and pain in the world. The trip ended when I woke up a couple hours later and proceeded to smoke some weed with my friends that were staying the night. The headspace wasn't brought back, but the melting and blooming visuals in the garage wall started to appear again.